Currently, I'm reading the world's classics, Thomas Hardy's Jude the Obscure. The earlier titles were The Simpletons, and another one was Heart's Insurgent. If you see Thomas Hardy, he essays the contemporary prudery of his times. His is a deep desire to break up the conventions in respect of manners, customs, religion. Now, in this book, there are 6 sections, each named after a setting in a particular place. He traces the journey of the protagonist, that is Jude, in whichever place he was. And look here, it is Mary Green, part first. Second is Christminster. Third is Melchester. Fourth is Shaston. Fifth is Aldbrickham and elsewhere. And part 6th again is Christminster again. So the protagonist goes back to Christminster, and you'll come to know about the obsession he has with this place because of the hallowed portals of education, and you will see it later on. And actually, as I read through this, I particularly have found his desire, the protagonist's desire, to study heart-wrenching. An 11-year-old boy's tearful farewell to his teacher, who is going for higher university education at Christminster. So that is what, then it stuck to her. That particular place became his religion, sort of. He wanted to be there. In his heart and soul, he reveres it. He reveres that place. He wants to be there. The reverences, to quite an extent, you'll find in the book. His unfulfilled dreams all connected to this Christminster. And all these places, all the 6 parts of the places, as I would say, it progresses the story of Jude Foley and his relationships and the tragic outcomes due to societal pressures. Now, the tone initially is set up to show Jude's desire for education and a better life, and how later tensions rise, leading to tragedy, etc. He describes the hamlet of Mary Green, and I read, it was an old-fashioned, as it was small, and it rested in the lap of undulating upland adjoining the North Wessex Downs. Old as it was, however, the well shaft was probably the only relic of the local history that remained absolutely unchanged. Many of the thatched and domed buildings, houses, had been pulled down of late years, and many trees felled on the green. Above all, the original church, hump-backed, wood-turreted, and quaintly hipped, had been taken down and either cracked up into heaps of road metal in the lane or utilized as pigsty walls, garden seats, guard stones to fences, and rockeries and the flower beds of the neighborhood. In place of it, a tall new building of modern Gothic design, unfamiliar to English eyes, had been erected on a new piece of ground by a certain obliterator, of historic records who had run down from London and back in a day. The site whereupon so long had stood the ancient temple to the Christian divinities was not even recorded on the green and level grass plot that had immemorially been the churchyard, and obliterated graves being commemorated by 18 penny cast iron crosses warranted to last 5 years. So, I mean, before we go on, just look at, look at the language. It's so beautiful. Hardy has shown his Wessex, where he, it is of the novels and poems. So this is the map. Look at that. So you must know. So he's actually made a map to show where his character goes, and this township or the place. He's fictionalized this place so well. It is England, but yes, it's given a name Wessex. And let me show you. Can you see that Christminster? Yeah, that's it. So that was his Oxford University as such. Can you see that? Christminster. So I'm reading from the first chapter only, Mary Read. Now he sets out to just have a glimpse of Christminster, and he's walking. Not a soul was visible on the hedgeless highway on either side of it, and the white road seemed to ascend and diminish till it joined the sky. At the very top it was crossed at right angles by a green ridgeway, the Iceneel Street, and the original Roman road through the district. This ancient track ran east and west for many miles, and down almost to within living memory had been used for driving flocks and herds to fairs and markets, but it was now neglected and overgrown. The boy had never before strayed so far north as this from the nestling hamlet in which he had been deposited by the carrier from a railway station southward one dark evening some few months earlier. Until now he had no suspicion that such a wide, flat, low-lying country lay so near at hand under the very verge of his upland world. So he wants to get a glimpse of his dream place, that is Christminster. So he's crossing some workers who are working there. Somebody asks him, "Well, my lad, and what may you want up here?" So he says, "I want to know where the city of Christminster is, if you please." So the workman answers, "Christminster is out across there by the clump. You can see it, at least. You can on a clear day." No, you can't now because it was overcast. So the workman says, "I've noticed it when the sun is going down in a blaze of flame, and it looks like," and then he says, "I don't know what." And Jude answers, "The heavenly Jerusalem," suggested the serious urchin. "Ah, though I should never have thought of it myself, but I can't see no Christminster today." The boy strained his eyes also, yet neither he could see the far off city. So he descended from the barn, and abandoning Christminster with the versatility of his of his age, he goes away. So just imagine his desire to even have a glimpse of it. The way he has put it into writing, Hardy's way of telling us, we can sort of understand his deep desire to just have a view of it, even from such a distance. So at Christmas time, reading from the second chapter, so he goes to seek work over there. And let me just read out some lines. Passing out into the streets on this errand of finding work, he found that the colleges had treacherously changed their sympathetic countenance. Some were pompous, some had put on the look of family vaults above ground. Something barbaric loomed in the masonries of all. The spirits of the great men had disappeared. The numberless architectural pages around him he read naturally less as an artist critic of their forms than as an artisan and comrade of the dead handicraftsmen whose muscles had actually executed those forms. He examined the moldings, stroked them as one who knows their beginnings, said that they were difficult or easy, and the working had taken little or much time, were trying to the arm or convenient to the tool. So he's come here to seek employment because renovation work is going on in the colleges, and he goes to the yard. The yard was a little center of regeneration. Here, with keen edges and smooth curves, were forms in the exact likeness of those he had seen abraded and time-eaten on the walls. These were the ideas in modern prose which were colleges presented in an old poetry. Even some of those antiques might have been called prose when they were new. They had done nothing but wait and had become poetical. How easy to the smallest building, how impossible to most men. He asked for the foreman and looked around among the new traceries, mullions, transoms, I don't even know what they are, shafts, pinnacles, battlements, standing on the bankers, half-worked or waiting to be removed. They were marked by precision, mathematical straightness, smoothness, exactitude. There in the old walls were the broken lines of the original idea, jagged curves, disdain of precision, irregularity, disarray. For a moment, there fell on Jude a true illumination that here in the stone yard was a center of effort as worthy as that dignified by the name of scholarly study within the noblest of the colleges. But he lost it under the stress of his old idea. He would accept any employment which might be offered him on the strength of his late employer's recommendation. He just wanted to work there, even as a worker, if not as a student. This is what is written here. So he perceived that at best only copying, patching, and imitating went on here, which he fancied to be owing to some temporary and local cause. He did not at that time see that medievalism was as dead as a fern leaf in a lump of coal, that other developments were shaping in the world around him, in which Gothic architecture and its associations had no place. The deadly animosity of contemporary logic and vision towards so much of what he held in reverence was not yet revealed to him. So I'm reading again from At Christminster again, that is the 6th chapter. and he comes with his second wife, his cousin Sue. Then he says, "This place seems gay," said Sue. "Why, it is Remembrance Day, Jude, how sly of you. You came today on purpose?" "Yes," said Jude quickly, as he took charge of the small child and told Arabella's boy, that was his son from his earlier wife, Arabella, to keep close to him. And Sue attending to their own eldest. "I thought we might as well come today as on any other." And she says, "But I'm afraid it'll depress you." "Oh, I mustn't let it interfere with our business, and we have a good deal to do before we shall be settled." But no, he wanted to be here. So he looks at the hurrying crowd and says, "No, we must. Let's us go and see the procession, and never mind the lodgings just now. We can get them afterwards." So no, he just wanted to be there. He wanted to be there around the college, around his university of his dreams. Crowds of pretty sisters in airy costumes and meekly ignorant parents who had known no college in their youth were under convoy in the same direction by brothers and sisters, brothers and sons bearing the opinion written large on them that no properly qualified human beings had lived on earth till they came to grace it here and now. "My failure is reflected on me by every one of those young fellows," said Jude. "A lesson on presumption is awaiting me today, humiliation day for me. If you, my dear darling, hadn't come to my rescue, I should have gone to the dogs with despair." So he also gives her a backhand compliment. So, and Sue just tells him again, "Let's go about our own affairs, dear. I'm sure this sight will awaken old sorrows in you and do no good." So he replies, "Well, we are near. We will see it now." So they turned in on the left by the church with the Italian porch, whose helical columns were heavily draped with creepers, and pursued the lane till there arose on Jude's side the circular theatre with that well-known lantern above it, which stood in his mind as a sad symbol of his abandoned hopes. For it was from that outlook that he had finally surveyed the city of colleges on the afternoon of his great meditation, which convinced him at last of the futility of his attempt to be a son of the university. Today, in the open space stretching between the building and the nearest college, stood a crowd of expectant people. A passage was kept clear through their midst by two barriers, timber, extending from the door of the college to the door of the large building between it and the theatre. "Here is a place they're just going to pass," cried Jude in sudden excitement, and pushing his way to the front, he took up a position close to the barrier, still hugging the youngest child in his arms, while Sue and the others kept immediately behind him. The crowd filled in at their back and fell to talking, joking, and laughing as carriage after carriage drew up at the lower door of the college, and solemn, stately figures in blood-red robes began to alight. The sky had grown overcast and livid, and the thunder rumbled now and then. So his son, that is, he calls him Father Tim, shuddered. "It do seem like the judgment day," he whispered. So it starts raining, and Jude tells him they won't be long now, without turning his head. But the procession did not come forth, and somebody in the crowd, to pass the time, looked at the facade of the nearest college and said he wondered what was meant by the Latin inscription in its midst. Jude, who stood near the enquirer, explained it, and finding that the people all around him were listening with interest, went on to describe the carving of the frieze which he had studied years before, and to criticize some details of the masonry and other college fronts about the city. The idle crowd, including the 2 policemen at the doors, stared like the Lyconians at Paul, for Jude was apt to get into enthusiastic over any subject in hand, and they seemed to wonder how the stranger should know more about buildings of their town than they themselves did. So he was so into stuff. He had learned the Latin language on his own. So in reply to all what's going on in the crowd, Jude gets into a phase of self-pity and says, "I may do some good before I'm dead. Be a sort of success as a frightful example of what not to do, and so illustrate a moral story," continued Jude, beginning to grow bitter. Though he'd opened serenely enough, I was perhaps after all a paltry victim to the spirit of mental and social relentlessness that makes so many unhappy in these days. So Sue tells him that, she's trying to assure him, no, you're not that, and all of that. Just when all of it was going on, as a sort of objective commentary on Jude's remark, they drove up at this moment with a belated doctor, robed and panting a cab, whose horse failed to stop at the exact point required for setting down the hirer, who jumped out and entered the door. The driver, alighting, began to kick the animal in the belly, which Jude didn't like. I mean, he had a soft heart for say, nature, for everyone, living things. And so he says, "If that can be done at college gates, in the most religious and educational city in the world, what shall we say as to how far we've got?" So Sue persists. "Let's go on, dear," she whispered, endeavoring to shelter him. But he says, "Just a moment, they're coming now." So a peal of 6 bells struck out, human faces began to crowd the windows around, and the procession of heads of houses and new doctors emerged, their red and black glow and forms passing across the field of Jude's vision like inaccessible planets across an object glass. As they went, their names were called by knowing informants, and when they reached the old round theatre of Wren, a cheer rose high. "Let's go that way," cried Jude, and though it now rained steadily, he seemed not to know it, and took them round to the theatre. Here he stood upon the straw that was laid to drown the discordant noise of wheels, where the quaint and frost-eaten stone busts encircling the building looked with pallid grimness on the proceedings, and in particular at the bedraggled Jude, Sue, and their children, as at ludicrous persons who had no business there. "I wish I could get in," he said to her fervidly. "Listen, I may catch a few words of the Latin speech by staying here. The windows are open." However, beyond the peals of the organ and the shouts and hurrahs between each piece of oratory, Jude, standing in the wet, did not bring much Latin to his intelligence, more than now and then a sonorous word in and ibis. "Well, I'm an outsider to the end of my days, he sighed after a while. Now I'll go, my patient Sue. How good of you to wait in the rain all this time to gratify my infatuation. I'll never care any more about the infernal cursed place. Upon my soul, I won't. But what made you tremble so when we were at the barrier? And how pale you are, Sue, etc. So look at the cover. It's a huge building. Must be his Christminster, what he idolized, in fact. So actually I was particularly taken in by this his desire to be there, and there'll be millions and millions of people who desire to study, and there are millions and millions of people who get an opportunity and they don't really, with all the degrees they do nothing. And this is a in this story you have multi-layered strands of class struggle, like the study part, he wanted to study at Christminster, then unconventional relationships, that with his cousin Sue and his earlier marriage, and it is a societal critique. And as the story progresses of his relationships, there are tragic outcomes because of these societal pressures. He works as a stonemason but dreams of studying at Christminster, as I just read out. So look at his intense desire for education. And his wife, Arabella, the earlier one, she's there throughout the plot. And it highlights the flaws in in him and in his younger days. And Arabella is also, through Arabella, she's there with through her son, little Jude, the thinker, the great thinker, or whatever. So he's the one who sort of brings about the greatest tragedy in his life. He's instrumental in that, and tensions arise because of the tragedy. Sue, his love interest, he loses, and his cousin, he loses her. Even in his thinking, while he was contemplating or he liked her, there were thoughts in his head that he really didn't want to get married because of certain societal reasons. The first reason was that he was married and it could be wrong. The second was that they were cousins. It was not well for cousins to fall in love, even when circumstances seemed in favor the passion. The third, even were he free in a family like his own, where marriage usually meant a tragic sadness. Marriage with a blood relation would duplicate the adverse conditions, and a tragic sadness might be intensified into a tragic horror. So harsh realities and limitations make an individual victim to one's circumstances. Pessimistic outlook, fatalism, all of this you can experience when you read the book. So I'm going to read a little from another book, which is a critical biography of Thomas Hardy, a critical biography by Evelyn Hardy, 1954, the Hogarth Press, London, pages, it's from this chapter, The End of Prose Writing. In fact, this was almost the last of his novels. Then he was really criticized for it so much that he took up on writing poetry after this, basically. So the seed of the story starts from Berkshire, journey to Great Folly in Berkshire, where his grandmother lived. And there, the visit to Great Folly and to Oxford, thence he went over there, he made in 1892-93 for the purpose of gathering body and color for his next novel, which that is Jude the Obscure. And the Hardy had once met a lad driving a baker's cart who asked if he might borrow a Latin grammar from him, and this incident is vividly made use in this book. And in as early as 1887, he had been making notes for Jude, and in April 1888 had written in his notebook a short story of a young man who could not go to Oxford, his struggles and ultimate failure, suicide. There is something in this the world ought to be shown, and I'm the one to show it to them. So he really, and though I was not altogether hindered going at least to Cambridge, he writes that he's made a diary entry like that. So the seed of Jude the Obscure lay germinating for 7 years before its appearance in a serial form, December 1894 to November 1895. Hardy published a letter called On the Tree of Knowledge in the New Review in company with other contributors who had been asked whether a young girl should be informed of sexual matters before marriage. He alone amongst the contributors made the suggestion that boys as well as girls should be initiated. So, and he writes, he says that for it never struck me that the spider is invariably male and the fly invariably female. So it is almost like he felt that always the females are ensnared, but it could be the other way around. So Jude's sexual ignorance is one of the causes of his lamentable marriage and his ultimate downfall. And Hardy's aims in writing Jude are clearly given in his preface to the novel, which, you must read and see. Let me just... Well, this is a preface. It's around 3.5 pages, and it talks about the history of this novel, whose birth in its present shape has been much retarded by the necessities of periodical publication, is briefly as follows. So you can go through it. And he says, Jude the Obscure is simply an endeavor to give shape and coherence to a series of seemings or personal impressions or questions of their consistency or their discordance, of their permanence or their transitionariness, being regarded as not of the first moment. And then there is a postscript also. The issue of this book 16 years ago with the explanatory preface given above was followed by unexpected incidents, and one can now look back for a moment at what happened. So all of that. If you're really interested in the history of it, you must read the preface. So in the letters he says that the grimy features of the story go to show the contrast between the ideal life a man wished to lead and the squalid real life he was fated to lead. The throwing of the pistol. Now what does that mean? That is, the throwing of the pistol at the supreme moment of his young dreams is to sharply initiate the contrast. So what do you mean by throwing of the pistol? It means to surrender at a critical juncture. So because you are unable to cope with the challenge. So all of that. The idea was meant to run all through the novel. It is in fact to be discovered in everybody's life, though it lies less on the surface perhaps than it does in my poor puppets, he writes. Of course, the book is all contrast, or was meant to be in its original conception. Sue and her heathen gods set against Jude's reading the Greek Testament. Christminster academical, Christminster in the slums, Jude the saint, Jude the sinner, Sue the pagan, Sue the saint, marriage, no marriage, etc., etc. So he also writes, he stresses, makes all of this makes for the morality and the delicacy or indelicacy in a writer in according to his object. And he goes to write that if I say to a lady, I met a naked woman, it is indelicate. But if I go on to say, I found she was mad with sorrow, it ceases to be indelicate. And in writing Jude, my mind was fixed on the ending. So, Jude was meant to be a study. Hardy's closest approach to the psychologically subtle approach to the psychological study after, say, Michael Henchard. So, and the novel, whatever he wanted to show, whatever he came up with, a psychological study or whatever, but there were many who found it meaningless and emasculated even when it appeared in serial installments. So there was this lot of criticism. So, like for example, there was an irate bishop in England and a man in Australia burnt. The former denounced it in a letter to the Yorkshire Post, calling it garbage, and the latter informed Hardy that the packet of ashes enclosed were those of the pages of Jude. The antagonist's reviewers called it titanically bad, an exposition of the unclean, a deplorable failing off. On the other hand, admirers gave it extravagant praise. It was the most splendid of all the works which he had given to the world, one of the most touching records in all our literature. It was profound and unfathomable, depths of gloom and greatness. So, Swinburne comforted Hardy by assuring him that the tragedy was equally beautiful and terrible in its pathos. The book was said to be a treatise on the marriage question as well as an autobiographical element. Christminster was pointed at as being Oxford, and all of these, of course, Hardy stoutly denied. And he was now nettled and stung into defiance, bewildered by the virulence and the number of the attacks, and determined to escape the legend of himself. Once again, he seemed to have been unaware of the vehemence of the bitter and aggressive sides of his nature. He thought himself as a mild, inoffensive countryman, a harmless agnostic, rather than a clamorous atheist, a teller of tales, a recorder of seemings or impressions, a chronicler of moods and deeds, rather than a philosopher or reformer. He liked to be called the man with the watching eye. Humility made him say to a reporter that he was only a learner in the art of novel writing, and that, as regards Tess, it was too much to hope that he had been able to bring about any change in the treatment or the attitude to those intricate problems which hedge about the sexes. So what is it that angered and disgusted the readers of Jude the Obscure? Granted that the Victorian world was hardly ready for the psychological intricacies of Sue or the unconventional illicit relationship between her and her cousin Jude, there is more to their objections than cavilling at convention. Their response is that of the healthy to the morbid. The book is steeped in bitterness, and redemptive forces seldom spring from this emotion, generally a sign of defeat and spiritual immaturity. Jude verges on the pathological. It is a theorem clothed in language rather than the study of warm blooded human beings. Above all, it stands as Hardy's final testament to disillusion. The theme which had attracted him from the beginning, that is, whatever attracted him, it was like all disillusion. The romantic goes under bloody but unbowed, it is true, but with an aching, empty, and broken heart, disenchanted with marriage and unmarried relationship, the consolations of religion, the possibility of a poor and gifted man scaling the ladder of learning without influence, disillusioned over the charitable hearts of scholars and theologians, the fidelity of women, their ability to think and grow dispassionately, disillusion finally made by the quenching of the light from his own soul, which, like Jupiter, the golden jonquil, had steadfastly guided him as a youth. The darkness and bitterness of his mood, the reverse of that ardent buoyancy which had elated him as a young man, is so intense that one cannot help identifying it as the unacknowledged story of the development of Hardy's own soul. His desire for learning, that is the way, that is sort of brought forth and has enabled him to write with particular pathos of Jude's hunger for learning and his primitive attempts to obtain it. Jude Folly might be regarded as a heartbreaking caricature of what Hardy, but for his talents, his mother's ambitions, and the good fortune of having Isaac last, harass Marmule to guide his intellectual growth, might have been. So, in visualizing Jude's struggles to learn Latin and Greek, Hardy very naturally went back to his own first classical studies, and we find his character mastering and admiring passages of Iliad and the lyrics of Horace and Greek Testament, just as Thomas had done more than 40 years before. On the other hand, Sue, the rationalistic counterpart of his poetic cousin Jude, is a devotee of Mill, etc. What's interesting is it's written that furthermore, Jude delights in deciphering the Latin inscriptions on 15th century brasses and tombs, a favorite pastime of Hardy's, who had a predilection for medieval Latin. It is against the ethereal vision of Christminster desired that we must set the action of Jude, for in this novel there is no substantial background such as the heath, woodland, downs, meadow. Jude's obsession with Christminster and what it may lead him to is a fixed vision, and the vision, and in brackets it's written, and the emotion it arouses in him, close brackets, resembles the New Jerusalem with which Bernard of Murals or the tortured Elizabethan recusants console themselves, a city expected by eager hearts. So here again I'm reading. He meets a carter, like Giles, with a heavy load and a string of belt horses, who tells the boy that as for music, there's beautiful music everywhere in Christminster. And when he walks on alone, he reflects to himself, it had been the yearning of his heart to find something to anchor on, to cling to, for some place which he could call admirable. It is a city of light, he said to himself. This is Jude thinking. The tree of knowledge grows there, he added a few steps further on. It is a place that teachers of men spring from and go to. It is what you may call a castle manned by scholarship and religion. Again this figure, he was silent for a long while, till he added, it would just suit me. The boy's mystical ardor dims as he grows older, yet even in young manhood he can describe it with poetic imagery using astronomical simile. There is more going on than meets the eye of a man walking through the streets. It is a unique center of thought and religion, the intellectual and spiritual granary of this country. All that silence and absence of goings on is the stillness of infinite motion. Contrasted with this vision of the academic city are those other aspects of it which the varied sides of Hardy's nature depict. Christminster, which raises persons like radishes in a bed, or the town with a life, infinitely more palpitating, varied, and compendious than the grown life, the reality of Christminster. Passages like this show his kind nature, the authors. Jude feels a kinship with the hungry rooks, defenseless earthworms, trapped rabbits, and growing things around him. A magic thread of fellow feeling united his own life with theirs. He was a boy who could not himself bear to hurt anything. He had never brought home a nest of young birds without lying awake in misery half the night after, and often reinstating them and the nest in the original place the next morning. He could scarcely bear to see trees cut down or lopped from a fancy that it hurt them, and late pruning, and then the sap was up and the tree bled profusely, had been a positive grief to him in his infancy. This weakness of character, as it may be called, suggested that he was the sort of man who was born to ache a good deal before the fall of the curtain upon his unnecessary life should signify that he was well with him again. So this has a ring of self-revelation, it's written. And that flaw in the terrestrial scheme by which what was good for God's birds was bad for God's gardener. So Jude stands as a denial of life as we know it, the crux of the problem being that we are self-contradictions from the start, animal beings endowed with intellectual and spiritual aspirations which seldom harmonize with our primitive sexual urges, and a sensitivity in excess of our courage or physical strength. Added to this, there is the further complication which man has consciously evolved a society so artificial that it seems to turn the normal sex impulses into devilish, domestic gins and springs to noose, and hold back those who want to progress. All this Hardy has pointed out less forcibly in other prose works, but in none of them has the will to die out of life, which reaches its apex in unappetizing figure as Jude's son, being so strong. This negative urge is generally set down to Hardy's reading Soco Penhauer, Schopenhauer, but we have seen other examples. The masochistic cry of Tess to Alec is matched by that of Jude, who bids Sue crucify him if she wishes, for he is hers and hers alone. There is so little alleviation from tragedy, so small a respite from the major theme of wormwood marriages, which corrode and corrupt, that we turn away feeling the book is inartistic, false to life and to art. Well, in an unfinished essay on Hardy's novels, D.H. Lawrence makes the trenchant comment that Jude the Obscure is not a true and essential tragedy. Necessarily painful it was, but they were not at war with God, only with society. Yet they were all cowed by the mere judgment of man upon them, and all the while by their own souls they were right. The judgment of man killed them, not the judgment of their own souls or the judgment of eternal God. And he stresses that this is the weakness of Jude and of modern tragedy, in which transgression against the social code is made to bring destruction, as though the social code worked our irrevocable fate. So, since Hardy himself never broke away from the moral code which many of his protagonists transgressed, it is worth considering whether he himself was not taken in by which in his novels he affected to despise. Lawrence closes his essay by saying that to most of us, as to climb, the map of social code appears more real than the land. So, actually, it's a nice book. You must read, and Hardy, read all of Hardy's books. And just to end, at the age of 58, when most authors have turned from the making of verse to prose writing, Hardy reversed the process. The novel writer risked abandoning himself publicity to that form of art which had always been more instinctive with him. In his own words, a sense of truth of poetry, of its supreme place in literature, had awakened itself in me. At the risk of ruining all my worldly prospects, I dabbled in it, was forced out of it. It came back upon me. All was of the nature of being led by a mood without foresight or regard to whither it led. So this is where I read all the critical analysis. It's a critical biography by Evelyn Hardy. And that's there for you to see. And that's Thomas Hardy by Augustus John O.M.R.A. Many talk of his great charm and extraordinary simplicity. He was rather below medium height, slim, erect. His face was not strongly lined, his complexion was clear, etc. I mean, if you want to find out, again, go through this book too. And in the end, it is Arabella talking about Sue, the other woman in her life, after Jude passes away. And she says she may swear that on her knees to the Holy Cross upon her necklace till she's hoarse, but it won't be true, said Arabella. She's never found peace since she left his arms, and never will again till she's as he is now. And that's the end.